My grandfather was a Kansas farmer and he had worked hard his whole life. But around the time he was retiring, his wife, my grandmother, got Alzheimer's disease. He had lived a very virtuous life, but he wasn't rewarded with free time. And so my first vagabonding trip when I was 23 years old was sort of undertaken with the conviction that I might not have a chance to do it again. It wasn't an act of rebellion, but an act of common sense to find ways to make room for travel. We're conditioned to be afraid of travel because the news media is often negative news, wars and famines and floods and things that encourage us to be afraid of the world.
Is it true you traveled with just zero luggage?
No luggage or bags of any kind, not even a plastic bag with my toothbrush and my spare socks. Everybody is born equally rich in time. Time is the wealth. Do you travel to find yourself? Well, maybe.
Why are people so scared to go traveling?
I think that we're conditioned to be afraid of travel because we get a lot of the information is from the news media. The news media is often negative news. The metaphor is it's a man bites dog world. You don't read news stories about a dog biting a man because it's too common. You hear about the man biting a dog because that's less common. Well, oftentimes headlines are bad things. It's wars and famines and floods and things that encourage us to be afraid of the world. So that's one thing that certainly can dissuade us from traveling. And another thing too is expense. That oftentimes travel is seen as a consumer product that costs a lot of money. It's seen as something that you throw money at. And I've always tried to encourage people to find ways to travel within whatever budget you have. Oftentimes you can go to non-industrialized country, your money goes a little bit further. And so you actually don't need to be rich to travel. That's another big fear that people have. Danger and expense are two big ones. And then difficulty is another one. Just the idea that travel is this very complicated and confusing world, when in fact, travel has been one of the main conditions of the human experience for as long as there have been humans. And figure out ways to get from point A to point B, places to stay. And in the information age where you can go online and get all sorts of information about almost any place in the world, there's less of an excuse not to travel because you can get a sense for what it might be like, even if the place is on the other side of the world.
You kind of figured out quite early on you did want to independently travel everywhere and things like that. Do you remember the point that came to your head when you realized that the normal life, so to speak, wasn't really for you?
It's a sort of a somewhat dramatic or poignant backstory that I didn't write about in Vagabonding, even though it was really about vagabonding. I think in the United States, especially, we're sort of conditioned to compartmentalize travel, either as something you do on vacation or something you do when you have time for it at the end of your life, when you're retired and you have more of an opportunity to do so. But my grandfather was a Kansas farmer and he had worked hard his whole life. But around the time he was retiring, his wife, my grandmother, got Alzheimer's disease and he just couldn't. And I think I learned at a very young age that working hard and playing by the rules that society gives you for when you should have free time in life doesn't always get rewarded, because he had lived a very virtuous life, but he wasn't rewarded with free time because he spent his retirement taking care of my grandmother. And so my first vagabonding trip when I was 23 years old was sort of undertaken with the conviction that I might not have a chance to do it again. I was wanting to scratch a travel itch that I was afraid I would not be able to scratch at any other time of my life. And I sort of felt like I was breaking the rules. Like by being different, I was being a little bit subversive. But what I found from that first trip is that it wasn't as difficult or expensive or complicated or dangerous as I thought it would be. And that it was actually, it wasn't an act of rebellion, but an act of common sense to find ways to make room for travel in my life instead of expecting or accepting the idea that travel is designed for certain times in your life, just making travel happen in a quiet and firm way. And I've been living on that principle ever since. It's been a long time since I was 23 years old. I turned 55 earlier this week. So what is that? That's more than 30 years. But that principle has still been paying rewards, that I can create time in my life for travel, or really for any experience that interests me, not by throwing money at it, but by sort of problem solving and figuring out ways to make it happen.
You traveled with genuinely nothing.
Yeah, that was sort of a stunt back in 2010. It's been 15 years ago. I traveled around the world with no luggage or bags of any kind, not even a plastic bag with my toothbrush and my spare socks. And I think that didn't turn me into a person who never travels with any luggage. But I think part of the point was that we don't really need to bring very much to travel, not just around the world, but to have an amazing time in doing so. I had a travel vest that I kept a lot of spare things in. Before I took that trip, a lot of people said, well, I wouldn't want to sit next to you on a plane. And it's like, well, it's not like I'm not taking a bath. It's like I'm actually taking a bath and washing my clothes every day because I have to. It's as clean as I've ever been as I've traveled. But I think I proved my point. It was a blast. It was an amazing trip. My cameraman for that trip, which was 10 years ago, he and I went to an NFL game, went to a Chiefs game a few days ago. And it's still a very memorable part of our experiences because we had a blast. We didn't need to bring a bunch of equipment, bags to have a good time. So even though I don't travel without luggage all the time, I proved to myself and hopefully to some other people 10, 15 years ago that you can travel with no luggage if you put your mind to it. So simplicity is a big part of my travel philosophy in that you can simplify your life in such a way that it pays out in free time to travel, but you can also simplify your life in such a way that you really don't need to buy much equipment to travel for a long time. You can just make it happen.
I'm interested in that reflection specifically because people naturally attain any type of life to getting as much as possible, whether it's money, it's materials, things like that. But you literally traveled with nothing. Did that teach you anything about materialism or like the want for things?
It sort of proved a point that I'd already been experimenting with before then, which is that more things in life aren't where satisfaction and happiness in life happen. Material possessions serve a purpose, but I think sometimes in many Western capitalist or Eastern capitalist societies that sort of encourage us to solve problems by buying things, to assuage anxiety by buying things to solve those anxieties. If you realize that life's pleasures are pretty simple, that you can go for a walk and make your anxiety go away, that you can travel to the far side of the world and spend less money every day as a traveler than you do at home. You can go to a place like Thailand or India and literally spend less for everything than your daily life at home. Then you realize that you don't have to put material possessions in the center of your life, that you can buy enough material possessions to make your life comfortable, but use, I call it time wealth, that basically instead of putting your wealth into possessions, you put it into time and you become rich in time. And this doesn't just apply to travel, it can apply to your family life. It can apply to your hobbies or your spiritual life or anything, that you use the money that you have to pay off in free time in a way that enriches all aspects of your life instead of just accumulating more possessions.
Tell me about time wealth, because I feel like a lot of people do brush over that aspect of life looking for the possession wealth.
Everybody is born equally rich in time. And if we see time as a currency, it's not time is money. It's not like I'm going to make my day more efficient so I can make more money and buy more things. No, it's like time is the wealth. It's not using your time to make more material wealth. Time is canvas onto which you paint your life. And oftentimes it's through the pursuit of material wealth that we burn up a lot of time that could be spent having fun. And I think in my conversation with Tim Ferriss years ago, he said that he actually knew billionaires who had no time to go to a meeting for one weekend. They're so busy chasing their wealth and attending to their six houses that they never live in that they didn't have time to actually do very simple things that a much humbler lifestyle could result in. I think that it's easy to forget too how often we get possessions that we never look at. My parents weren't materialistic people, but they moved into assisted living 3 years ago now. And in helping them empty out their house, we just realized how much they had purchased for themselves, which seemed important maybe 1, 10, 20, 50 years ago that they haven't looked at or thought about, but even haven't even thrown away. So I spent so much time taking things to thrift or to the garbage. I have a friend who does reselling things on eBay, which is sort of fun to see. But I just realized that even my parents who had lived a full life, they had things in their life that they never thought about. That just to me underscored how, at the end of their life, they not only didn't talk about their things, they didn't even remember the things that they had. What they talked about is the experiences they had. And sometimes they were travel experiences with me. Like I went to China and Mongolia with my parents. My parents didn't have passports until I did. I went to China and Mongolia. I went to Paris and Prague with them. And that led to so much happy memories and conversation in ways that a lot of the physical things that we bought didn't serve our lives. I'm not a monk or a madman. I don't think that you should just live in a loincloth in a hut on a mountain. But I think that you really need to strike a balance between things that are making your life better versus the time that you have to live your life in an exciting way. And like I say, it's not just about travel. It could be spending time with your family. It could be spending time with your friends or doing hobbies or things you love. And I think once you learn to instinctively set your time wealth, decision making is easier. Instead of feeling compelled to buy things to make your life less anxious and more enjoyable, then you spend your time in ways that make your life more enjoyable and less anxious.
It's quite a cool concept for life, looking more towards time wealth, like almost like seeing your time as a bank balance. It's quite fun way to look at
Mm.
life, because then you can, like you said, you can actually do meaningful things with it and have stories to tell like you do. But it's quite an uncomfortable approach to, especially to begin with, to start thinking, right, instead of thinking about my financial bank balance and things like that, where I'm going to need them in the future. I'm going to go and just spend my time making as many memories as possible. And when you did that, I'd imagine that was quite a uneasy process at the beginning anyway. But with that time that you did spend traveling, what did you learn about discomfort?
Well, discomfort pays rewards. I think more and more we're encouraged to avoid discomfort when in fact, if you allow it to, travel takes away all the comforts behind which you hide. You can be on the other side of the world and you can take a nice, expensive, air conditioned bus to tourist attractions, or you can just take a cheap bus that the local people take to places that aren't tourist attractions but are full of interesting things. And so I think it's through discomfort that you live more as a pilgrim than as a consumer. Because I think in Western society, it's pretty easy to see everything as a consumer experience. Is this worth the money? Is this going to make my life better? When in fact, if you just walk through life in such a way of, here's an experience that I didn't expect to happen. Let me figure out how to navigate this experience and what it can teach me about life and about myself. Then that's when things become really interesting. I traveled around the Pacific Rim with my wife last year, and we stayed in some pretty nice hotels in places like Bali and Thailand. But it was actually the experiences we talk about the most are the times when, say, we were in Vanuatu, the island nation in the South Pacific. The national airline went out of business right before we got there. And so we had to travel everywhere by cargo ferry. It was not comfortable at all. It was not fun, but it made us adjust and it made us realize that most people in the world don't have money to fly every place. They have to take uncomfortable boats and buses places. And it was through having a relationship with that discomfort that we had empathy for the people we were traveling around. And it made us experience those ways. It made us find our own resources. And it made us realize that actually it's not that bad. It's not comfortable to sleep on the deck of a passenger boat and then try and find shelter when it rains, but life doesn't end. And in fact, that makes you taste the time wealth a little bit more. It's through the discomfort that you realize that yeah, life is playing out in an interesting way, and I'm not comfortable, but I can see all the stars in the sky because I'm away from all the lights of the cities. I'm out on the South Pacific, and there is treasure in being able to see the skies in a way I've never seen before and maybe never will see again, even as I'm having trouble sleeping and I'm lying in a pile of cigarettes and peanut shells.
Did that make you appreciate the little things in life a little bit more?
It absolutely did. It made me appreciate little things like comfortable beds with blankets and silence. I think we sometimes forget what a blessing things like indoor plumbing are. We went to an island called Malakula, and then from there to an island called Uripiv, which there's no plumbing or electricity on the entire island. People just they use trench toilets or they use solar electricity when they need electricity, and they usually do without it. And even though it was uncomfortable at first, we learned to live with it because the people there lived without it. And it was so interesting how everybody there knew their neighbors and kids were running all over the village unsupervised because everybody knew each other's kids. There weren't really any technologies to get in the way of them living a very traditional communal life. It was interesting. Just like after I traveled the world with no luggage, I don't travel the world with no luggage all the time, but it made me appreciate how easy it is to go without. And so now when I do live in a house, as I do now with indoor plumbing and plug in electricity, I can taste that a little bit better. Instead of ignoring that and complaining about superficial things, I can appreciate the simple pleasures of life.
Even if you think of coming back from like vacation, like you are almost happy to get back into routine a little bit. Like you do appreciate the routine a little bit more because you're all over the place. But someone who doesn't, I mean, you technically never had a routine whenever you were traveling, really. What was it? What's it like for you coming home though? Because it's almost like home for you isn't really what your purpose is at that point.
My last chapter of Vagabonding is about coming home. It's amazing how many people want to talk about that chapter because you come home from travel and you feel transformed and your life is invigorated. And suddenly you're really excited that you can stand in your nice hot shower because you didn't have one when you were on the island of Uripiv. And your friends don't really care because your friends are like, okay, what happened? Okay. And they go on and talking about their own life. That basically those like showing off your travels is never as fun as having them because people at home don't really care. They have no frame of reference for these amazing places and experiences that you had. And so you really have to re-embrace home in a quiet way and realize that, yeah, it is nice to have a nice big television with channels that you like to watch and a shower with hot water that you didn't have on the other side of the world. Then sort of re-entering those routines. You use the word routine, but I think sometimes routines are good. It's good to have a semblance of a kind of routine as you travel, because I think one mistake travelers make is that they assume they take the attitude of home to their travels and they just start partying. And they'll party 7 days a week on the other side of the world. And they won't understand why they're depressed after a month. It's like, I've partied every day. Well, I think sometimes partying at home is something you do in contrast to the banalities and the difficulties of work and home. And then when you can party every day, you realize that without the difficulty, the party isn't as much fun. Like waking up early and writing in a journal for 20 minutes or 1 hour every day about what happened the day before. Or maybe going to the gym or finding an alternative to going to the gym, doing a workout, going for a walk or doing some push ups or pull ups, trying to learn a new thing every day or at least every week, taking a cooking class, learning a martial art. Those sorts of routines and structures actually help you experience travel in a way that goes beyond sort of the tourist checklist or the party every day until my life becomes pointless compulsions of travel, because then you sort of take the best parts of your routine on the road and you're keeping your fitness at a high level. You're keeping your education going. You're not just passively accepting travel as something that's air quotes fun, but you're making your life fun by sort of integrating a dynamic routine into the changes of travel. And I think in some ways that helps take away from the anxieties of travel. It's like, I know it's 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to write in my journal for 20 minutes, and every day I am beholden to that. Or I'm going to learn a new skill. I'm going to learn how to cook one dish in every city I go to. And then suddenly that becomes something you look forward to. And the structure isn't a compromise of your day, but it's a way to get more out of a new place, a place that you might not know where to go, but you know that you're going to write in your journal in a cafe, and you know that you're going to learn to cook one meal in every city. And suddenly that's a lens into a new place that you wouldn't have had without that routine.
I started recently journaling, and the one thing I've noticed from it, which I want to get your opinion on, is I don't fully think I was immersing myself in just normal experiences before I started journaling because I wasn't processing them. And you mentioned about specifically people who are traveling doing it. And the thing that comes to my mind is the people who document their entire travels. Do you think that we're getting too much on the documenting traveling now instead of actually being in the moment when we're traveling?
It used to be the question of, when you point your camera at something, are you seeing it better or are you putting a barrier between yourself and the experience? I think it's always a balance of being sort of recording the trip and reflecting on the trip as opposed to actually experiencing the trip. Because sometimes if you're always outward looking, if you're always experiencing, if you're not sitting down and writing in your journal or talking to your YouTube channel about it, then you're not really processing that experience. You're not allowing, and sometimes the journal doesn't need to be, I did this, I did this, I did this, but it can be, I felt this and it made me think about this experience I had a long time ago. I think that sometimes processing your emotional and philosophical life is as important to the journal process as documenting what you did from day to day. Like sometimes a camera can be a way to look for new things. I teach a writing class in Paris every summer, and we have experiences in psychogeography where you find different tricks to help you pay attention to the city. So I'm going to walk through the city and I'm going to look for the color green. I'm not going to look for any specific thing. I'm just going to look for green things. And it's through looking for green things that you look beyond the tourist cliches in a city, and suddenly you're seeing things that you never would have looked for in a city. And that's a way of, even though it's sort of a routine, it's a game through which you seek things. It's not limiting what you see. It's trying to look for things that you hadn't seen before. So sure, you can use your camera. Your camera can be something that comes between you and an experience, but hopefully your camera can be a way to see things you hadn't been looking for until you took out your camera and thought, what around me is interesting. Yeah, so it's tricky. This is a conversation that's been happening for a long time, but it's a good conversation to have, because I think one needs to strike a balance between living the trip and then documenting and reflecting on the trip.
It's gonna sound bad, but I think you're part way responsible for this because of how successful your traveling stories and stuff became. I mean, you were like technically the first digital nomad in a way. Like there weren't really anybody like you at the time, and it was before social media, before everybody was a digital nomad. But do you feel like you have rubbed off on the whole travel and influencer type thing?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of digital nomads or influencers who will sort of be paraphrasing vagabonding. You know, they'll quote their favorite quotes, but then they're not really living it in a sense. You know, because oftentimes I talk in vagabonding about getting out of your comfort bubble, or about finding ways not to travel with other travelers, but to travel with local people. And so I think a lot of times, and I don't want to be too critical, but digital nomads or influencers, it's clear that they're still in their comfort zone. You know, that they're taking pictures of beautiful things and they're looking very handsome or beautiful in front of the camera, but they're not really getting into the gritty of the travel itself. Or maybe they're living a digital nomad life, but they're living in a compound with good Wi-Fi and a bunch of people from Europe and North America and East Asia, but not from people where they actually are in the Middle East or South America or something. So I guess the one loophole I have for the people that says, oh, you influence digital nomadism and digital nomads are ruining these places is to say, well, if they're sitting in a wired compound and not being very adventurous, and if they're sort of living a cliche, then they're not reading my book very closely, because vagabonding isn't about competition with other travelers. It's not making yourself look good to other people. It's about quietly making your life better. And so if you're investing too much time as an influencer and looking super handsome and always making the right decisions and always eating delicious food for your Instagram audience, then maybe you should invest more time into quietly making mistakes and learning from those mistakes, because really the core of vagabonding is about being humble and not comparing yourself to other people, but about quietly learning more about the life there is. And it is, I mean, it sort of feels good to say that I influence this movement that has millions of people doing it now, but I don't want to be too so hubristic as to think that, oh, that makes me important, that I still, even though I influenced these trends in a certain sense, it's good for me to also keep learning and making mistakes and being humble and not comparing myself too much, because that sets a good example of the for people who are maybe using my book to travel in a certain way, but are also tempted to be into that conspicuous consumption competitive aspect of digital nomadism or influencer. So I think humility and sort of quietly improving yourself is a good default, regardless of what societal trends are telling you to do. Hopefully, I haven't ruined any places through trends that have started with a little bit of philosophical salting from my own books.
I think one Google search would prove to people that you definitely have influenced the framework. Maybe not the execution, but the framework. And whenever I was listening to you talk about that, I had a different idea in mind of my opinion on it. But something then came to mind whenever you were like describing the kind of like the real experiences when traveling to the documented, maybe fake type of ones. And it's like, kind of almost seems like the parasocial identity is taking over a little bit. Like people are, I think these, like, this is no shame on like people who are travel influencers, but I do think they started out wanting to live the vagabonding lifestyle originally. That was where they drove from. But they then started to identify more with their audience who just wanted to see glamorous parties, the great views, all this stuff. And they forgot then to be kind of in the moment, like we spoke about. And I think that's the problem. But that's what I wanted to ask you originally about. How did you like stop yourself from becoming that person who just wanted to travel and tell all the beautiful stories? Because I've read some of your stories and you really did go everywhere. There was nothing you shied away from. Like, how did you stop yourself from wanting to go see the glamour side of it and go and see the girly part?
Well, I was lucky in that I started out as a traveler before social media. I think philosophically, a lot of people go in wanting to be a very pure, open-hearted, vagabonding mindset, but then all of the likes on Instagram or TikTok come from things that are pretty simple. And I've seen this in my own travels. Like I'll have a very nuanced, complicated experience in a place like Sumatra, and it'll get a fraction of the likes of just me on a beach in a beautiful place. And so I think that feedback loop can it sort of cheapens people's travels. It sort of flattens their travels into the cliches that look good rather than the things that deepen your life, because so much of what travel can teach you is through the mistakes, through not looking good and through being humbled and through talking to people who aren't glamorous and learning from them and learning new things. And so I think that influencer world it's very mediated, it's very flattened, and it's superficial. It's driven by algorithms. It's driven by attention spans and robots, basically. If that's the metric through which we seek approval in life, then we're letting the robots and the algorithms sort of decide what we're going to do. You see it on influencers. There's a lot of burnout. A lot of YouTubers and Instagrammers, they're sad and they're burned out and they're tired of feeding the monster of content. They're frustrated that sometimes the experiences that were personally meaningful get less likes and less views than the very generic experience of a very common thing. And so I think the secret here is just to find some sort of distance from the technologies that through which we perform our lives. I guess oftentimes I say you need to travel back in time to 1999 when I first started traveling. Travel to a time before social media when you didn't have that as an option. And if likes on Instagram or TikTok or views on YouTube weren't dictating your decisions, what decisions would you make? And it's interesting to see how oftentimes those are more satisfying. They're not as interesting for your audience, but why should your audience dictate how you live your life? Why should your boss or your family dictate how you live your life? I think we use freedom as a word in travel. Oftentimes it's freedom from the factors that would limit how you live. And sometimes your Instagram audience can limit how you live, even as it's reinforcing a certain aspect of how you live. So it's a strange catch-22 these days. There's no simple way of solving the problem, but it's good to think about it and talk about it and think, could I be living in a more satisfying way if I cared less about the approval of social media? And one final thought there is that I don't want to be the guy who's in his 50s now and is wagging his hand at people in their 20s who aren't living like I did when I was in my 20s, because I understand how we live in a technological moment. And I think that we all have these human resources that within the technologies that we have, we find a way to balance them with our own humanity, because sometimes the best way to come into a relationship with a new place is just to go for a walk in that new place and just sort of be surprised by a new experience, be it listening to the sound of a bird you've never heard before, or smelling a dish you've never heard of before, and eating it and ordering it from the street food cart. I think those surprises are sometimes the most gratifying part of travel, even though they don't always play well on Instagram.
You rolled into freedom a little bit there, and that's where I was trying to roll into as well, because that's quite a big part of your vagabonding experience. I mean, you created the freedom to go and do all these things. I mean, a lot of people don't have that opportunity. Do you think that your traveling helped you discover who you really were as a person?
Absolutely. I think I did. And I think that's something that can become a cliche. Do you travel to find yourself? Well, maybe, but if you travel to find yourself, maybe it's harder to find yourself than if you just travel to travel. Oftentimes I'll speak at universities and the students are really nervous about, oh, should I take this fellowship? Should I do this internship? Should I do this experience? And it's like, well, go have fun. You give yourself permission to have fun. After 3 days, you'll be tired of partying, and if you just follow your interests and your passions, then you'll drift away from the partying. I think oftentimes we forget that we are wiser after 3 days in a new place than we were for any months of researching travel about that new place. And so letting travel teach you is a part of, quote, finding yourself. And I think sometimes when people come back from travel changed, what they've done is that it has given them perspective on how they live at home. Because, I mean, there's this joke that these little fish are swimming through the water and they come into the big fish. And the big fish says, "Hey, boys, how's the water?" And then they swim on, and the one little fish turns to the other fish and he's like, "What the hell is water?" Right? The water we swim in is something we don't even see anymore. And so travel allows us to see the water we swim in. It allows us to see our own habits of home. It allows us to see how all the pretensions and the performances and the silly rituals through which we perform our lives at home, which become less important once we're overseas. And so I think it's by stripping away the relationship to our own community and our own family and having a relationship with other communities and other cultures through which we find the core, sort of our human core that isn't hiding behind those cultural routines and rituals. And I think that's what, when people say they find themselves, that's what they're talking about. And oftentimes it isn't something that you can throw on Instagram. It's a quieter, more spiritual realization about what's important in life. Even getting back to the time wealth and sort of seeking experiences that are meaningful to you. And so as a metric, we can keep score money wise. Oh, I have $1 million and you only have $100,000. So I'm winning. Whereas with time wealth, it's like, well, I care a lot about birds and you care a lot about sports and you care a lot about meeting people. And those metrics are personal to each person. And so through time wealth, it allows you to stop competing with other people and just sort of live the life that interests you, and finding ways to interest that, and finding ways to teach yourself new lessons about life in the world and other parts of the world.
Someone commented on one of my videos a while ago about something about the whole like finding yourself traveling. I think it might have been on the episode with Matt, but somebody wrote that I guarantee if you polled these people who find themselves when they go traveling, majority of them have never sat down for half an hour with nothing to do.
That is a wise thing. I think sometimes we can micromanage our own self-discovery in a way that leads to non-discovery. Absolutely. I think even sitting with nothing to do for 30 minutes at home, if you're not used to it, can sort of teach you about yourself and what you're anxious of, and what your attention is drawn toward. I know that oftentimes the idea that you find yourself, that you discover new parts of yourself with travel, has become a part of it's been a part of the travel community for so long that people are sort of in that force field of saying it without doing it. I met an anthropologist once who studied travelers, and she discovered that travelers lie the most often about how little money they spend and how much time they spend interacting with locals. And so she said, "Well, let's see your budget. What have you spent your money on?" Among certain travelers, spending less money is a higher status symbol. That they get more out of less. And so they actually do spend money on comforts that they shouldn't be ashamed of. But then also, she asked them, "Well, when do you interact with local people?" Well, mostly she found they interacted with people from the tourism economy. The local people they met were dive instructors and bartenders and taxi drivers, and not everyday normal people. They met local people that were actually serving their comfort, right? And so I think sometimes leaving your comfort zone and getting into new experiences is harder to do. It's sitting still for 30 minutes is hard to do, even on the other side of the world. Even on the other side of the world, where sitting still for 30 minutes allows you to see the world in a new way. Yeah. So I think getting past the cliche level of self-discovery and getting into actual self-discovery, those are two different things. And sometimes things like sitting still, or just sort of striking up a conversation for someone who isn't in the service economy, are windows into kinds of self-discovery that go beyond the cliche.
It's quite weird how like I naturally wrote about this the other day in my journal about the levels of boredom and what's a safe level of boredom. It's like people who are just the right medium of bored will be right. Got nothing to do. I may as well do that thing I was putting off for however long it was. People who are too bored do stupid things. So when they come back to the next point where they're bored, they have so many more things to do because not only did they put them off, they've now created more problems. But it's
Right.
kind of the same as what you mean with like having too much freedom. People who travel and have too much freedom, they
Yeah.
do then become that person of forcing the travel instead of letting everything happen when it's there. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I think we bring in so many expectations to travel that we almost want to check things off the list. I mean, that's why there's the phrase "a bucket list." When sometimes the things that are most amazing about travel are things that would never have occurred to us because we haven't experienced them yet. And then leaving yourself open to boredom is good, but then giving yourself structure, like we talked about earlier, finding ways to sort of create a daily routine, maybe a little bit of journal here, a little bit of self education here, a little bit of walking through a neighborhood you've never heard of before here. And then suddenly you're living in a more dynamic relationship with your day than just sort of passively following what you think you should have experienced there, following your bucket list instead of just following your heart or your five senses, or things like that.
I've got the travel god here. I may as well use him now to get some life philosophy out of you. So, was there one country in your entire travel and portfolio that taught you the most about life?
Ooh, the most about life. Oddly enough, it's probably the United States, because that was my first big vagabonding place. Like, I learned those initial lessons. I said that your first vagabonding trip teaches you the most if you let it, not because it's more sophisticated, but because it's the least sophisticated. You're experiencing all these things for the first time. So it was when I was 23 years old and living in a van, I just learned so many things from being in the United States, that I didn't take a lot of money to have a good time, that you don't have to always go to tourist attractions, that sometimes just striking up conversations with random people can be a great thing. So, one, the United States was great for me. I think anyone can discover a lot in their home country, even if they don't have the money to leave their home country yet. There's a lot of base level things they can learn there. My other answer to that is Korea, not because I went there as a tourist, because I went there to teach English as a foreign language for 2 years. And it wasn't always easy, but I learned so much from just living in another culture. much in the same way that I learned so much by traveling in my own culture about traveling itself. I learned what culture is by living in Korea and trying to work there. And I was teaching English to students, but my students were teaching me things about cultural difference that I had no idea existed. And to this day, I have a special fondness in my heart for Korean. My birthday was a few days ago. My wife cooked me Korean food because it's sort of my comfort food now. Because I went through all of this, I sort of had this emotional rawness when I was in Korea because I felt so uncomfortable. I felt culture shock. Culture shock is a good thing. It's when you're learning that your culture isn't the only culture in the world, and that no, people aren't trying to make you feel uncomfortable on purpose. It's just that the level of culture is a little different in a different culture than in your own culture. And so, man, what a blessing it was to be in Korea and to learn things in a new way. And it's funny that I mentioned those two because both of those things happened when I was quite young. It was my first time living overseas and my first time vagabonding in my own country, through which I learned these important lessons. And one thing I allowed myself for both was lots of time. I spent 8 months traveling, living in a van. I spent 2 years in Korea. I was earning money at the time, but it was through that long, intentional, non-hurried experience that I allowed myself to be open to all these things that changed my life.
Jamie Mustard was here and he spoke about the happiest people he ever met in his life were in the bush and they were living in mud huts and they were just so happy to be together. But you traveled around so many more places and you've seen so many more aspects like that. What did all your traveling teach you about the importance of community?
Oh, a ton, a ton. And I'm sort of being reintroduced to the idea of community because for years I was based in Kansas without really living in Kansas. I'd come back home, throw down my bag, wash my clothes, leave again. Then I met my wife here, and like she's just more socially sophisticated from me. I'm sort of building this community in a place that I've lived for 20 years, but never properly built one. And so I think travel really teaches you how community is part of people's wealth. The guy you interviewed was alluding to this. I've been to so many countries that are poorer than my own country where they just see their own family as wealth. You know, when I was in my 20s, people would ask me, "Are you married?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not married. I don't have kids." And they say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." They would say this in Cambodia or Kenya or something because to them, family was wealth. They didn't have a lot of money in the bank, but they had this family and they had this community. And it was through that that they formed their identity. And I think oftentimes when we talk in the West of freedom, we think of freedom to do whatever we want. And that's a nice freedom to have. But the joy and the wealth of community is sort of the flip side of that. It's having duties to people you love and to people you are concerned about. And it was like being that in that village on the island of Uripiv, and all the kids ran around with no adult supervision because everybody knew who everyone belonged to. Having a familiarity with the community is important too. So I've learned that early in life, it's good to journey and enjoy your freedom and practice your individuality. But if you stay open, it will teach you through being in other communities how to live later parts of your life because people's happiness so much of the time comes through from their family or from their community or from the traditions that have informed your life. Yeah, use individualism to start your journey, but it's like the hero's journey. Are you familiar with the idea, Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey?
Yeah.
It's sort of the storytelling template. The hero's journey always returns to home with the wisdom of the journey. And the home is your community. And as a well traveled person, you can bring the wisdom of the rest of the world to your home community. And you can sort of create a family, either a literal or metaphorical one, that is in conversation with the rest of the world. We live in a time where even if we live in a very provincial place, it doesn't have to be cut off from the world itself. And so I live in a rural Kansas. I live in a fairly provincial place, but I am in conversation with this place and the world in general in a way that is very much a blessing of being alive in this moment in history.
Yeah, I don't think there's a time that the hero's journey applies to more perfectly than now because everyone thinks that like any kind of bump on the road is kind of like their life being over. Like I use this story so many times about, like, say there's a guy I speak to on Twitter for he's a boxer, and I asked him one time, just out of interest, what's gonna go through your head if you do lose? Because he's undefeated, and he said, you do realize that when you lose, you don't just get shot in the face the next morning. Like you do wake up the next day, and I couldn't. He put it up. He put it up as a post, and it got so much traction. People were like, "Oh my god!" And he actually said that I could put up a picture of this thing he was reading that said the hero's journey, and goes, "This was wrote about 40 years ago, and people are still not realizing what this applies to life."
Fighting is a good metaphor because fighters don't become better fighters by winning all their fights. Boxers with the most beautiful faces probably haven't landed many punches. They haven't really learned how to fight yet. I'm not a fighter. Martial arts isn't my thing, but I do know that it is through failure that become better. I mean, I'm a writer, and it's through all the failed writing that eventually led to my success as a writer. Vagabonding wasn't the first book I wrote. It was the failed books that I wrote before Vagabonding that taught me how to be a writer. It's through losing fights that you learn how to win fights. It's through having difficulty in life that you learn how to have success in life. And that's a part of this hero's journey. I mean, that's a whole other hour of podcast conversation, because the hero's journey involves mentors. It involves companions. It isn't just one person doing their thing. That any hero's journey involves people more experienced in life that help you through the journey. And it doesn't just involve going to another part of the world. It involves coming back home and becoming a mentor to other people. So it's a really beautiful metaphor to think not just about travel, but about life. Yeah.
Well, during your like traveling days, was there ever a point you feared for your life?
No, but maybe there were times when I should have feared for my life. I took a boat down the Laotian Mekong without really knowing how to drive a boat very well. In retrospect, that wasn't very smart. I've been pretty successful in avoiding political unrest and crime for the most part. Most of the crime that I've suffered has been low-level, pickpocket-level crime. But I'm sure there have been situations that I've been walking in areas that were probably not wise for me to do so. But I will say, God, I've been traveling how long? More than 30 years now, and I haven't had any very horrible experiences. My second book, Marco Polo Didn't Go There, I do write about getting drugged and robbed in Istanbul, and that was an unsettling experience. But I learned from it and made a great story. So I guess I'm proof. I mean, there are people who have tragic things happen to them as travelers, but there's people who have tragic things happen to them at home. And so I have lived a pretty intrepid travel life, and I've managed to avoid having anything too horrible, crime or disease, happen to me. Although I have experienced a little bit of crime and a little bit of disease.
It's so funny you say that because Matt, when he was here, said the same thing that he never really had a point of fear for his life. I know his travel wasn't quite as extreme as yours, but do you think we I don't know if it's over glamorize is the right word, but we think too much about this fear of death whenever we go traveling?
I think eventually you stop worrying about it. I think it's always good to be cautious, but not fearful, because statistically, I don't think travelers die at a higher rate than people die at home. Occasionally there'll be a wreck or a shooting or something that makes a lot of headlines. I think we sort of fetishize the potential of bad things happening in our travels, when in fact we're away from home, but we're among people who are also away from home. And it's amazing how much care people in other places place on travelers, especially outside of tourist zones. That people would think, oh, this guy's far away from home. Let's see if they're okay. Let's see if they need help or advice. Sometimes they want to scam you, but oftentimes people are just like, you're not from around here. Let's find out what this guy wants. Let's see if this guy wants to come to our wedding or our street party or our concert. And so, yeah, I think danger is an overblown. It's an important precaution, but it's not a good fear, because travel tends to not be that much more dangerous than any other aspect of life.
I've got two last questions for you. Two completely different avenues, but I had to get one of them in before the end of this. But I've read somewhere that you had some sort of influence on the 4 Hour Workweek book, which is one of the most like impactful books on people in general. But did Tim ever tell you what it was specific that influenced?
It's the metaphorical time wealth aspect of it. It's the slow down and allow things to happen rather than force things to happen. I think that Tim was sort of conditioned in that very high pressure business world that was about doing more and experiencing less at the end of the day. And so I think time wealth was an important thing for him. I think one anecdote that really resonated with him was an anecdote of Charlie Sheen from the movie Wall Street, that he says, if I can make enough money in this racket and get out of it, then I'll have enough money to ride a motorcycle across China. And when I watched that, I'd been traveling just a little bit, and it's like, it doesn't cost that much to ride a motorcycle across China. You don't need to go to Wall Street and make $1 million. This is my cat, by the way. And I think that really landed for him, because he came up in Princeton University. He went to an Ivy League school that had this pressure to perform and measure metrics in material wealth rather than time wealth. And so I think that it was that aspect. It's like, to travel the world, you just don't need money. In fact, you don't need much money at all. You just need to know what you want. You need to know that time is where your wealth is. And I think it's it's interesting that that book is called The 4 Hour Workweek. It's not literally about reducing your work week to 4 hours a week, but it is about reinventing your relationship to time. And so I think that's the texture that he got out of Vagabonding. And Tim has become a friend. I enjoy communicating with him several times a year.
Yeah, I can't remember the creator. There's a content creator that all like he makes fun of people who chase money over experiences, and he had one of the quotes one of his videos was, "It always gets me is there's 19 and 20-year-olds hustling for money like they're going to be able to buy their teenage years back." And I thought it was
Huh.
so good. It's like that, like, because the time wealth thing that you talk about, it's so perfectly linked to that. Because you'd rather use your time now than look back when you don't have much left and go, should have experienced so much more.
Yeah, there's so many. The 20s is a good decade because it was an important decade for me. But there's so many people who work hard trying to get rich in their 20s. When who needs to get rich in their 20s? You have all this wealth of life. Make mistakes, go on lousy dates, go try talent. Learn a sport that you'll be bad at. There's no better time to do silly things and to try things that maybe they'll change your life and maybe you'll be a failure at, because that's the life when you shouldn't be making money. You should be making time to figure out what you love. I think there's some people who go to an Ivy League school, they'll learn how to make a lot of money, but they don't understand, apart from the money itself, what they actually want in life. Where sometimes you go to the other part of the world and you realize that you really love architecture or kickboxing or cooking, and then suddenly you have learned in a way that university doesn't teach you what you actually are engaged in by life. And again, it's that metric, it's that time wealth metric of knowing how you want to spend your time rather than keeping score of how much money you have.
Again, another topic we could talk for hours about. But one last question, because I feel like I'm holding you hostage. But if you could redo one of your traveling journeys as the person you are now, where would it be?
Ooh, that's good. Is it like just to enjoy it, or to see what it's like now as opposed to what it was like before?
We'll go with the angle of to experience it now, but with the knowledge and the person you are now.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, a part of me would do that van trip all over again, but I probably wouldn't do the van trip again because I would want to bring my wife and she probably wouldn't want to live in a van. So it might be that first vagabonding experience, that when I took a big circle around Asia in my late 20s and late 90s. I think that, and I've done little tastes of that. Like when my wife and I went to Thailand last year, it was so interesting to revisit Thailand decades after having experienced it for the first time. I would like to experience that again in other parts of that journey, in Egypt, in Russia, in Eastern Europe. Um, yeah, no, maybe I should write a book about that. I should go to the exact same places I went to when I was 28, except be 58 or 68 or 78, right? I think that would be amazing, just because uh, the philosopher Heraclitus said you never step in the same river twice because it's a different river and you're a different man. And those places are different and I'm different. And so I think that would be a really exciting journey, because that journey changed my life so much in different ways. And it would really be fun to go on a pilgrimage of my own life and just sort of see what has changed and see how I have changed. That's a good idea. I'll have to do
I love
that.
those residuals.
Yeah, yeah.
So, it's time to release you now. Rolf, where can people find you? What have you got out at the moment? What's coming in the future?
Okay, well, you can find me at rolfpotts.com, which is literally actually came up. It was down for the past week. My rolfpotts.com, that website had a technical problem. First time in 20 years it's happened, but it's back. Rolfpotts.com sort of aggregates almost everything I've done for the last 25 years. All my books, all my articles, all my podcasts, all my videos are there. That's a good place to go. I'm working on a new book now. You can find out more about it at rolfpotts.com. I also am working on video essays and new podcasts. You can find it all there. I'm at Rolf Potts at Instagram and other social media, but rolfpotts.com is the one place to find all things professional and a few things personal about myself, and to get started, and hopefully to get some ideas. Your listeners get some ideas for their own journeys and their own creative journeys from that website as well.